And if you go to the chat box at the bottom, you can type a response there. And the time difference, Michael, is what, 4 hours difference? Is it 2 in the afternoon there or 3?
We're at 4. We're at 3 o'clock here. You're at 10. It's 5, isn't it?
So it's 5 hours difference.
In about, yeah, in around that, yeah.
So right at 3 o'clock. Okay, so we are 3 minutes past 3. So in order to not delay too much, we can make sure we can get through all our information. I would say we should probably get started here in a second if everyone's ready. Got a few more folks coming in. I see Rory coming in as well. Welcome, Rory. I think you're coming in from the West Coast, possibly. San Francisco. So it's early there for you. All right. So everyone good? We're ready to go. We're about 4 minutes past. I think we can go ahead and get started. And then as more folks come in, they'll have the recording afterwards in case they missed the first few minutes. So with that, welcome everyone. Kayad Mila Falta. We're happy to have you at this webinar with us today, where we're going to talk about the entrepreneurial mindset and some depth into that, and how we've worked with EELI and Michael Shields in Ireland to try and bring the concepts around the entrepreneurial mindset and our work here at the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative to more folks across Ireland. So thanks so much for spending the time with us today. We're going to take about the first 15 minutes and have Mr. Michael Shields talk through some concepts that will lay out why this is so important for the work, and especially for the transition year for students that are going through their transition year there at the schools in Ireland. Then we're going to take about 45 minutes, and the founder of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative and the co-author of Who Owns the Ice House, Gary Schoniger, will discuss some really critical elements behind our work and help redefine entrepreneurship in a way that all can embrace it. And I think you'll see the connection here to the ideas and the concepts that students need to be taught during that transition year when they're really trying to figure out what their future holds for them. And then I'm going to take up the last part of the webinar talking about our work around the world, how our professional development programs were developed, and just give you a few case studies that you can think about and connect to as we move forward. So thanks so much for being with us today. Michael, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and I'll get your slides running here so that we can get started with the presentation.
Thank you, Gary. Okay, or not Gary, but Rob. You ready? Now go ahead.
All right, I'll be sharing in just a second. There we go. And there we go.
Okay, guys, good afternoon, everybody here in Ireland. Our audience, mainly composed of transition year coordinators from north, south, east, and west of Ireland. You're all very welcome. Céad Míle Fáilte of Galair. It's a historic occasion for me because, in fact, it's the first webinar, I think, on entrepreneurial and entrepreneurship education in Ireland. And I really look forward to today, and in particular to welcome, as I said, all you guys, and in particular to welcome our VIP guests and also our VIP presenters, Gary Schoniger, who is a great friend of mine and who I met when I was over in the United States in North Carolina at the University in 3 years ago, and Rob, whom he was co-presenter with him. So I'm really looking forward to hearing you guys again, and it's a great privilege for me that you have joined the webinar, this webinar in Ireland. Just very briefly before I go into the first slide here, my knowledge of entrepreneurship in Ireland goes back to 2003, when I learned and I read a paper on education published in Europe, and it was the first time I ever heard that entrepreneurship was a mindset. And that registered with me. Since then, every newspaper I take up really talks about entrepreneurship, or starting a business or managing a business. But that was the first time I heard entrepreneurial mindset. And later on in my career, when I heard it again and again, I heard it from Professor Tom Cooney a number of times in Dublin, DCU Tom, and also from Gillian Barry. I don't know if Gillian present today, but I heard it from her as well. In LIT in Limerick, and in particular, as I said, it's about running a business. That's what the news media say, but it's not. You will see and hear a lot more about that from our guest speakers later on. So that's when I heard about entrepreneurship as a mindset, and I'll bring you right up to date to where we're at. An overview. At the present time, we move on to slide 2, please, Rob. Right up to date, Action Plan for Education 2016-19. The government, the Ministry of Education, the Department of Education have published an action plan for education on a yearly basis. In the year 2016, there was an element of the plan which stated categorically that they were going to create a stronger focus on entrepreneurship, creativity, and innovation. That was in the plan. The plan was reproduced 2017 and 2018 and 2019. Yet there was no action. And furthermore, a second element in the plan, Action 6.4, I think it was to develop new entrepreneurship education for schools. Now, Rob, next slide, please. The current situation is in the senior curriculum, and it's embedded in the curriculum, in the business studies program, and in the other LCVP program, and in the LCA program. There's a mention of entrepreneurship, and there are modular, there are smaller modules which can be taken by the students, particularly LCVP and LCA. But the business studies program emphasizes business methodology, and there's very little talk about entrepreneurial mindset. Next slide. Gary, please, or Rob. Next slide. Yeah, at the well, sorry. Yeah, we'll take that one. Entrepreneurship at transition year. I want to specifically state that that is at the perimeter of the curriculum. It's not embedded into the curriculum. It's not part of your normal weekly class program and your timetable. It's embedded at the perimeter of the curriculum, which means literally students have to take it outside of the curriculum program as an optional study, and perhaps even after class finishes in the day. There's the program called the Junior Achievement Program. That's a program which came from Europe. I think it came from the States initially, but it's the headquarters is in Europe. The Junior Achievement Program. That's a program that happens in quite a number of schools in transition year. Then there's the Student Entrepreneur Awards Program. That's a program run by the LEAs, the LEOs, sorry. LEO is the local enterprise office, which are attached to every county. They run the Student Entrepreneur Award Program, and that is a program that's run in schools, but it's at the perimeter, as I said. Then there's another program, the NFT program, which originated in the States, I think, and it's the Foróige is the one which that's done, and that's done external to the school, mainly in youth centres, out centres. Next slide, please, Gareth. All right, Rob. Next slide. Okay, maybe we could go back one slide, Rob, Gary or Rob. Yes, sorry. This is again entrepreneurship at the perimeter, and this is the new program which has been launched in Ireland by me, and in my partnership with ELI. You can see ELI and EELI. ELI is the American program, and EELI is my own program in Ireland, but working in partnership with ELI. And in that context, this the Student Success Program, where I trained as a facilitator in the States, in Morgantown, with Gary and Rob, and that was successfully piloted in 2 post-primary schools in Ireland over the last 2 years. We decided not to go national because, being new, we were cautious in introducing it, and we wanted to introduce it and to evaluate it and to get feedback from it. The 2 post-primary schools, I'm not too sure, is the principal registered there, Rob? Would Dermot Healy be on? Is Dermot Healy here?
I didn't see Dermot when we were logging in, but I haven't looked at the list. Okay.
Well, rather than mention the 2 schools, I don't have the GDPR. I'm cautious here, but there are 2 primary schools in Ireland who launched the program. One is in the southwest of Ireland, and the other one is in Dublin. Highly successful. We evaluated it, and in fact, I can say categorically that we met and it achieved the objectives of transition year. The outcomes in transition year were very closely related to the outcomes of the Student Success Program, called the ISOS program for short. Move on to the next slide. We'll talk about the testimonials. Just 2 or 3 comments from the course, from the students. A great course. I now understand how an entrepreneurial mindset can help me in my academic and personal life. I was very impressed with that particular student who wrote that. It was very exciting to think that that's at the end of the program. That's what they were able to say. You know, it was a great achievement. And one of the other interesting comments in the testimonial: I have developed and applied critical thinking and applied problem-solving skills. It was fundamental. It was a powerful statement. There were other testimonials, but I just picked out those 2 for today. So can we move on, Rob? Now, for the action program, it started 2016 to 2020. And I just telephoned the Department of Education 3 days ago. I was on to the Minister's office, and I asked when was the 2020-2021 program being published, because I wanted to see, was there any development on the guidelines for schools, entrepreneurial guidelines, which they had said they would publish. And the reply I got, in fairness to the officials, they came back to me and said that they hope to publish the action plan for 2020 to 21 early in January. I think perhaps what happened, that hasn't been launched, is the COVID, because everything had closed down here last February, March. And in fact, when I was in my second school delivering the ISOS program, Student Success Program, suddenly in the middle of the program, school closed, we all went home. And that's the way it has been. So unfortunately, I think perhaps the action program has been delayed and held back. Let's move on. Now, this is the very latest. And Professor Tom, we have been communicating together recently on this one. The Enterprise Ireland, which is a national body, published a multi-partner framework 3 weeks ago. And the title of the program was to deliver and design, and to design and develop and deliver a range of innovative initiatives, programs and support to foster an awareness of understanding for entrepreneurship in primary schools, education sector nationwide. Wow, that hit us, because that came from nowhere. And a budget of €2 million has been allocated. There are 1,200 primary schools, and they're going to put into the framework, they're going to have 300 schools per annum for 4 years. And they're going to divide the 2 million into an allocation of 500,000 per year. And there'll be 300 schools in the first year, 300 schools in the second year, 300 in the third year, and 300 in the fourth year. That's an absolutely, hit me, as being a major development. And it's new, but it's for primary schools. So I'm of the opinion that what's going to happen is that they'll go for the secondary schools next. And in that secondary schools, I hope that transition year will be an area which will be of major focus for the schools. So let's move on, Gary.
Two minutes, Michael.
Okay. I'm nearly there, yeah. That's the last slide, is it? Yeah. So having hit that last slide, having done the welcomes and all that, I can wind up now and say that we're looking at this year still, because, well, we don't know where we're going. We don't know, schools are only open. They're closed last February, so the plan isn't really, is vague. But I would be hoping that we will have a number of schools registered for the student success program in October, up to the end of October, and we will hit our target of how many schools we want to engage in that program during the year. I don't think there's anything. I don't think there's anything left for me to say other than that, and over to you and to your or esteemed guest, Gary.
Well, yeah, thanks, Michael, for laying out your work and how we've gotten connected now for a few years and gradually seen this come to fruition as you've done your work in a couple of schools there. Now we're going to have the opportunity to hear from ELI's founder and CEO, Gary Schoniger. And I think you're going to be intrigued by the concepts that he's going to bring up. And as we go, really try and relate to those kids that you have going through that transition year and how you think the concepts he's talking about are going to apply to them. And then I'll come up and we'll talk about some case studies and how it's been used around the world. So with that, I'll hand off to Gary and you can take it from here.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to share my screen here and make sure all that's working. Rob, are we looking good on the screen here?
We are. We're good.
Okay. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm honored to be presenting to you today. Michael has been just a phenomenal champion of our work. And so let me just kind of dig in here and talk a little bit about the entrepreneurial mindset and how that helps develop self-directed learners. That's the gist of this webinar. I want to start by saying that the world has changed in ways that now require all of us to think like an entrepreneur. And I'm purposely emphasizing the word think like an entrepreneur, because I don't mean to say that everyone should start a business or become a business owner. And this is my first point that I want to make. This is about entrepreneurial thinking and a broader application beyond just the business world. So when we look at what entrepreneurs are doing, these are people who are highly resourceful, they're resilient, they're able to identify and solve problems in resource-constrained, highly ambiguous environments, when the rules aren't clear and the path is not well defined, right? These are people that know how to mobilize resources and make things happen. And the point here is that there is unlimited global demand for people who can think like an entrepreneur. And one of the points that I want to try to make today is that entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills are 21st century attitudes, behaviors, and skills. Whether you want to call them soft skills, whether you want to call them employability skills, I hope that I can demonstrate the alignment in my presentation this morning. And again, sort of to reiterate this, you know, entrepreneurial thinking is not only about starting businesses, it's essential for organizations to adapt and thrive in today's rapidly changing world. And what we see over and over and over again are that the entrepreneurial skills are the skills that employers now demand, right? And they might not call them entrepreneurial skills, but that's what they're looking for. They're looking for people who are self-starters, who can identify and solve problems. They're not waiting for people to tell them what to do. They can figure things out and move. So another way of saying this is that the traditional employee mindset that once enabled us to thrive is rapidly becoming obsolete. And we can talk a little bit about what an employee mindset is, perhaps in the questions. So, you know, the world is waking up to this and to this idea that the importance of entrepreneurship education. And, you know, Michael, I was listening to some of your comments, and it's a little bit embarrassing because the United States, which is often looked at as sort of a leader in entrepreneurship in the world, is lagging behind in terms of this becoming a priority in the education space. But nevertheless, you know, I was delighted to find this quote in the Department of Business, Enterprise, and Innovation, that it's being entrepreneurial is not just about starting and running a business. It's about the willingness and ability of individuals to turn ideas into action. I mean, I think you can't say it better than that. You know, other big thinkers like the World Economic Forum are saying that entrepreneurship education is essential for developing the human capital necessary for building the societies of the future. One particular publication called Entrepreneurship in Education, published by the OECD in 2015, recognized the importance of entrepreneurship education to increase societal resilience. It's about individual growth, increased academic engagement, and improved equality. So, you know, we're delighted to see that other big thinkers are beginning to recognize the benefits of entrepreneurship education beyond just the business startup world. So, and Michael, you made reference to this in some of your comments, but the World Economic Forum has said that it's not enough to add entrepreneurship on the perimeter, and that it needs to be at the core of the way education operates. And I think this is really where our work lies, and the work of ELI and our partnership with Michael and EELI is to help shift entrepreneurship from the perimeter to the core of the way education operates. And a lot of what we do is train educators around the world about how to develop entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills in the classroom. So that's the big question. How do we shift from the perimeter to the core? So I want to talk about three basic things in the next 35, 40 minutes or so. I want to start by redefining the term entrepreneurship in a way that anyone can embrace. Then I want to talk a little bit about the mindset. What is a mindset? We hear this term more and more, yet we don't often understand what a mindset is, where it comes from, and the ways in which it can influence our lives, our decision-making without our awareness. And then lastly, I'm going to walk you through 8 core entrepreneurial competencies that we distilled from some research that we did at the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute in San Jose, California. So let's start with the redefinition part, right? A big part of the reason that we're stuck on the perimeter is because of the ways in which we define entrepreneurship. And so many of us hear this word and we think of these iconic figures, these brilliant young kids that come up with ideas and they receive venture capital, and next thing you know, they're billionaires and they're employing, thousands of people. Yet when we look at the data, what we find is this is a tiny, tiny fraction, a fraction of a single % of the entrepreneurial activity that's happening, at least in the US, right? So these what we call the high-tech venture-backed type entrepreneurs create what I would call a visibility versus a representation issue, right? It skews our thinking about how to be entrepreneurial, about who can be entrepreneurial. A lot of the other entrepreneurship education initiatives we see tend to associate it with small business development initiatives. So they equate entrepreneurship with, I'm going to teach you how to start a small business. And, the problem generally is that we fail to distinguish between entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills and managerial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. And so one of the things that I'm fond of saying is that the attitudes, behaviors, and skills required to discover an opportunity are distinct from the attitudes, behaviors, and skills required to exploit that opportunity. And of course, the former are entrepreneurial skills, the latter being managerial skills. So in 2008, I was hired by the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute in San Jose, California, to do a gap analysis on the entrepreneurship education ecosystem in the US. And what we found in this study was that the way entrepreneurship is being characterized in the classroom is largely divorced from the reality of what the typical entrepreneur is actually doing. And so what we found is that the entrepreneurs, they're not necessarily writing business plans. They're not doing market research and spreadsheets and SWOT analysis. That's not how entrepreneurs behave, right? If you observe them in the wild, that just doesn't match with what they're actually doing. So I want to draw your attention to this concept called transformation theory, which helps us disentangle entrepreneurship from management, from small business management. Really helps us look at it from a behavioral perspective, which is really where my interest lies. I've been trying to figure this out for more than 25 years. I've been interested in understanding what are the underlying beliefs and the motivational factors that drive entrepreneurial behavior. And when we look at the data, it's quite interesting. In the United States, about 2/3 of our students are not engaged in their learning, right? It's about 66% are not engaged in their learning. And ironically, that data matches with the workforce engagement in the US. About 2/3 of our workers are not engaged in their work. Yet when we look at the entrepreneurs, they tend to be what I would call hyper engaged, right? They're not saying, thank God it's Friday. They're saying, thank God it's Monday. And so this transformation theory will help us understand this, what I would describe as a behavioral phenomenon. So it works like this. In transformation theory, and by the way, George Land was a systems scientist, and he developed this concept to explain the nature of change within any living system, a human, an animal, an organization, a culture, whatever, a company. So what Land is saying, there are three phases of change. There's a discovery phase, there's a growth phase, and then there's an obsolescence phase, right? Or in some cases, the obsolescence phase becomes a reinvention phase where we return to the discovery phase and begin a new S-curve. So these orange dots represent what Land refers to as breakpoints. And you can read about this in his fantastic book called Breakpoint and Beyond. But the idea that Land put forth is that each of these phases requires separate rules for survival. And the trick is to understand which phase you are in so that you know which rules for survival apply. And, you know, the breakpoints, these orange dots are clearly represented in this illustration, but in real life, they're not always clear. We don't always get a memo that the circumstances have changed and the rules for survival have also changed, right? And as Darwin taught us, right, it's not the strongest that survive, it's the most adaptable. And with the ability to change that allows us to adapt and thrive. So in simple terms, like, you know, how do we survive as humans in a modern industrial economy, right? Adam Smith wrote about this in 1776. We all live by exchanging. So in the discovery phase, we learn how to become useful to other humans. I mean, I'm just trying to break this down into its most broadest, to this fundamental first principles, right? In the discovery phase, we learn how to survive. And for humans, that means we learn how to become useful to other humans. In the growth phase, we then adapt. We take what we found in phase one and we go out and apply it into the world. We actually go out into the world and we become useful, and we become better and better and better at becoming useful until the second break point occurs. And that break point is represented by the growth starts to slow. And that's either an indication that we're fading into retirement, we're sort of aging out, or the growth starts to slow because the world has changed and we must now reinvent ourselves, right? That's the basics of transformation theory. So the point that I want to make for this session today is that most of us have learned how to become useful within a highly stable, routinized, other-directed, rule-bound learning environments, right? And those learning environments are designed to help us function within highly stable, routinized, other-directed, rule-bound working environments. And this is these are the hallmarks of industrial era thinking. These are sort of the underpinnings of the last 2 centuries, right? Where we are obsessed with efficiency. And so these sort of represent some of the underpinnings of an employee mindset. These are deeply held assumptions that someone else is going to tell us what is useful. They're going to tell us what to do, when to do it. It's all other directed, it's systematized, it's routinized, and so forth. These are, I don't have the time to get into it, but this is sort of leading to some of the deeply held assumptions we have about an employee mindset. My point here is that the mindset that once enabled us to succeed within highly stable, routinized, other-directed, rule-bound systems is distinct from the mindset that will now enable us to adapt and thrive in a rapidly changing world. That's the big idea here. So the question I'm asking is, how do we figure out how to make ourselves useful to other humans when the rules aren't clear and the path is not well defined? How do we make ourselves useful within highly ambiguous, resource-constrained, self-directed learning environments? And that's where we look to the mindset, the methods, and the motivation of the underdog, everyday entrepreneur. And so I'm expanding this discovery phase, and I'm going to call it entrepreneurial discovery. So the discovery begins, right, at whatever phase we are in life. And here we're talking about students 15, 16 years old. We're immersing them into a highly ambiguous learning experience. Now, the point I want to make here is that the rules for survival are dictated by contextual factors that are often subtle and non-obvious factors, right? But the rules for survival are dictated by the situation. And two such factors are the ambiguity and the access to resources. So in an entrepreneurial discovery phase, there's very high degree of ambiguity, right? We're venturing off into the unknown. There's not a guided path. There's not a known curriculum. It's not a known system. It's highly ambiguous. There's also a resource constraint factor that's also very important to understand. When we look at entrepreneurs, this is the environment they're functioning in, highly ambiguous, resource constraint in circumstances. The first break point is reached when a connection with our environment is found. And for humans in a modern economy, that means we've figured out a way to make ourselves useful to other humans. And the connection is found when people are saying, hey, yeah, that's useful to me. I'll pay for that, or I'm using that, or that's going to become part of our systems, or we're going to use that idea, right? The point is that entrepreneurship isn't, the entrepreneurial discovery process is an evidence-based process. It's not gambling. It's not fortune telling. It's the scientific method, and the entrepreneur is behaving much like a detective who's trying to solve a mystery. So, what are the rules required for survival within this highly ambiguous, resource-constrained environment? Broadly speaking, it's problem-finding skills. This is where it begins, with empathy, curiosity, observation, and inquiry, which then lead to problem-solving skills, creativity, critical thinking, experimentation and adaptation, collaboration, teamwork, networking, effective communication, and resourcefulness, to name a few. It also requires self-direction and self-regulation. It requires an internal locus of control. It requires ambiguity tolerance. I cannot overemphasize the importance of ambiguity tolerance, right? I'm saying over and over again, ambiguity tolerance is a superpower. It requires self-directed learning, self-awareness, and it requires resilience, the ability to get knocked down and get back up and learn from our mistakes and become stronger because of them. My point here is that entrepreneurial discovery skills are 21st century skills. You can call them whatever you want. They're discovery skills. And so can be developed is by learning in a highly ambiguous, resource-constrained environment. We must be in this resource-constrained ambiguity in order to develop these skills. So I'm going to conclude this first point here with my simple definition of entrepreneurship, which took me 25 years of research to recognize that entrepreneurship is the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. That's a simple definition that anyone can embrace, whether they want to start a business, whether they want to follow a traditional career path. That is the basic understanding of entrepreneurship. So I'm going to pause now and take a minute or two. If there's any questions in the chat, if you all have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. And if not, we can kind of move on to the and save the questions for the end.
And I should have pointed out, we have Nick Hool with us, who's running the technology. He's our client engagement lead. So there's Nick there. So he's available if you have any questions as well during the webinar. You just go ahead and put those in there, and we'll make sure they can get asked during our breaks.
So I'm gonna roll on here, if that's okay with you guys, and Nick can kind of monitor the questions as we go. So the second point I want to talk about here briefly is, what is a mindset? What does that look like? Where does it come from? How does it influence our decisions? So we all have a mindset, yet very few of us are aware of it, much less the ways in which it influences our behavior and our decisions without our awareness. That's, as Carl Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. It's another way of saying this, right? So a simple definition of a mindset is the underlying beliefs and tacit assumptions that influence our behavior. I'm going to emphasize underlying, right? It's the underlying, the tacit, the deeply ingrained, taken for granted beliefs and assumptions. So it works like this. On the surface, this is where we can, these are the visible artifacts and the observable behavior. Beneath the surface is what we say it's what we know and what we say that we value. These are our espoused values and our explicit knowledge. But our mindset is at the base of the iceberg. It's our implicit knowledge, our deeply held values, taken for granted beliefs, and tacit assumptions. So what shows up on the surface is much more likely to be the result of our deeply held values, beliefs, and assumptions, rather than our explicit values and knowledge, right? Another way of saying this is like, what we do speaks so loudly, I can't hear what you say. As our behavior ultimately betrays our deeply held beliefs and our values. So, for example, we all know people that complain all the time, right? That's the observable behavior that shows up on the surface. And when we ask people why they're unhappy, they're going to tell us, well, my boss is a moron, or my wife is the problem, or they're blaming, and so that's what they believe, that they want to do all these interesting, cool things in the world, but the world won't let them for whatever reason. That's their espoused values and their explicit knowledge. But when you dig a little bit deeper, that behavior is likely to be the result of a deeply held sense of powerlessness, an external locus of control, right? But they're not aware of these beliefs. So some quick things to understand about a mindset. It's unconsciously acquired, for the most part, through social influence and our subjective interpretation of life events, our experiences and events. It resides beneath our conscious awareness. Our brains are constantly seeking to automate. And this is where it's important to understand. Our brains are inundated with information, and we need to automate in order to reduce the cognitive load. So our brains want to rely on heuristics and habits and mental models that reduce the cognitive load. Our mindset operates effortlessly without our conscious awareness, yet at the same time, it's subject to all manner of predictable errors of judgment. So another way of saying this is our mindset draws from the past in order to navigate the future. A mindset in motion tends to stay in motion, right? And that's fine when the future looks like the past. But we tend to get in trouble when the future doesn't look like the past, yet we try to use the thinking from the past to solve the problems of the future. The bottom line here is that our mindset influences our motivation, our cognition, our emotion, and our choices. Pretty much influences all aspects of our lives. So we look at 5 critical dimensions of a mindset. Our self-efficacy beliefs. These are our deeply held beliefs about our own abilities to hit the goals that we set for ourselves in life. So a high degree of self-efficacy is on one end of the spectrum, where a helpless orientation is on the other. Perceived locus of control, right? People with an external locus of control have deeply held, mostly unconscious beliefs that fate or luck or circumstances or powerful others somehow control our lives. Those with an internal locus of control tend to believe that we're in control of our decisions and the outcome of our lives. But again, we're not walking around saying, hi, my name is Gary. I have an external locus of control. But it shows up in my behavior, in my actions, in my words. We look at the work of Carol Dweck at Stanford University, who has written extensively about this. Primarily, those with a fixed mindset believe that their talent, their intelligence, their abilities are finite, and that influences the goals they set for themselves, whereby someone with a growth mindset believes that their talent and ability can be developed through deliberate practice. We also look at motivation, basically intrinsic versus extrinsic. The literature is quite clear here. People who are intrinsically motivated outperform those who are extrinsically motivated. The difference is intrinsic motivation is the task itself is the reward. Extrinsic motivation is we're doing things for some other separable reward, be it a letter grade, a gold star, money, or some other motivation. Extrinsic motivation. And lastly, we look at resiliency, which comes from something psychologists call an explanatory style. Do we have a pessimistic versus an optimistic explanatory style? Those are the 5 critical dimensions of a mindset that we're interested in. So I'm going to move past the questions here, Nick, unless you've got something to stop me. I'm going to keep right on going for the sake of time. Here, I'm going to get into my third area here.
Sure. We've got a couple questions that we're fielding kind of in the chat that we'll bring up later.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Nick. So 8 core competencies. I want to quickly go through this. And as I was in my research for Cisco, I got the chance to do ethnographic interviews with hundreds of everyday entrepreneurs across the United States. Since then, I've done, several hundred more, including entrepreneurs in the UK, South Africa, Eastern Europe, Latin America, North America, Canada, Australia. And one entrepreneur, a story really kind of stuck with me. It was the story of Clifton Talbert and the influence of his uncle Cleve, a man with a 4th or 5th grade education, came of age in the segregated South. And this sort of became the inspiration for the Ice House program. It's the 8 life lessons from an unlikely entrepreneur that became the basis for the Ice House entrepreneurship programs. My point here is that we, after looking at hundreds of interviews, we distilled these 8 core competencies from the observation of hundreds of entrepreneurs. We just told it through a single story. And I want to get into those 8 core competencies very briefly here. But my point is that it seems to me that all entrepreneurial activity, behaviors, attitudes, and skills begin with this deeply held, mostly unconscious assumption that it's my responsibility to figure out how to make myself useful to others, and that by doing so, I can empower myself. That seems to be the genesis of entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. That's where it begins. And so, again, just as a reminder, it's really, we're crossing this chasm. We're trying to figure out, we're looking for evidence of usefulness. We're trying to find ways to make ourselves useful within highly ambiguous, resource-constrained environments. So in my analysis of these entrepreneurs, what I was looking for is the common factors, things that were common and replicable. These are IQ independent, they're resource independent, they're situation independent. And the foundation of it all, what we heard over and over and over again, is the entrepreneurs would articulate some sort of a compelling goal. They have a vision, or there's something that matters to them. There's a problem they're trying to solve. They're choosing the direction of their life. They're not just falling into it or fitting in, right? The second thing that we notice pretty quickly is that they look at problems as opportunities. And that's sort of the simple secret that they have trouble articulating. But they find problems and then they solve the problem and they figure out how to make that solution available to other humans. So that's really an important factor. I don't have time to dive into it there, but that's really the differentiator. They see problems as opportunities. They have a bias towards action. They act on their ideas. They don't spend a lot of time planning. And now, for those of you who are familiar with entrepreneurship education, you know that the business plan is the big idea here. And we found over and over and over again in our analysis that entrepreneurs aren't spending much time planning. And the idea here is what they're doing is they're micro experimenting. And it's the micro experimenting that enables them to tease out what I would call latent opportunities that are present but not visible. And that's very different from the way large organizations think. We also observe that entrepreneurs are constantly learning. They're known to be self-directed learners. And so we look at these 3 ideas here as recognizing problems as opportunities, micro-experimenting, and constantly learning as sort of the engine of entrepreneurial thinking and behavior. From there, they develop what I would call resourcefulness. They understand that it's not just about making money, that money ensues when you create value. They learn how to become resourceful. They learn how to make it work with what they have. They learn how to become reliable. They learn how to develop a community of practice. They surround themselves with other entrepreneurial people. So they create these self-directed learning environments. Some of you may recognize that term, SOLE, by Sugitra Matra. That's what entrepreneurs do naturally. They create self-directed learning environments. and they develop a high degree of resilience over time. So what I'm saying here is that it's the creating of value for others that empowers the individual. And this brings us to the sort of the motivational factors that help explain why entrepreneurs are so resilient, so resourceful, such creative and critical thinkers, so passionate and so committed to their goals, right? Now, some of you may be familiar with Csikszentmihalyi's work, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, which he's got the most unpronounceable name in human history, but nevertheless, his work in flow is where I got this, right? And so his thing is like, okay, here's our current reality, and there's a compelling goal. And when we're challenged above our skill level, we become very anxious. Yet when our skill level exceeds the challenge, we become bored, right? And so it's the compelling goal that leads to the optimal engagement, right? We become optimally engaged in the self-directed pursuit of a compelling goal. I'll say it differently. It's the intersection between the individual student interests, their abilities, and the needs of other humans. It's in that intersection right there that the student becomes optimally engaged. So if you want to understand why the entrepreneur is so resilient, resourceful, creative, critical thinker, all of those things, we need to stop looking at that as a dispositional effect. And we must recognize that it's really all about the pursuit of a compelling goal. That's what comes of it, right? So the 5 critical dimensions of an entrepreneurial mindset, what we see over time is that they develop a high sense of self-efficacy. They develop an internal locus of control. They develop a growth mindset. They become intrinsically motivated, and they become highly resilient. The point here is very, very simple, yet potentially profound. The entrepreneurial mindset is not the cause of the behavior. It's an effect of the behavior. And so we see these very successful entrepreneurs, and then we say, oh, in order to be successful, you have to have all of these traits. And what we fail to recognize is that's backwards. We develop these traits over time from the pursuit of a compelling goal. So I want to close by saying 2 simple things. Entrepreneurship is the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. And by creating value for others, we empower ourselves. We tap into the most potent form of human motivation, which is intrinsic motivation. The last thing I'm going to say, and we'll go to questions here, is the quote from Alvin Toffler, who in his book, Future Shock, he laid out the idea that at some point, the rate of change is going to exceed our ability to adapt. And that's where his quote came from. The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write. It will be those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the hallmark of an entrepreneurial mindset. So I'm happy to pause now. I know we're a little bit over time, which I'll blame on Michael. But let's take some time for questions, and then hopefully we can also have a little bit of time for questions after Rob's session.
Okay, great. I'll read. Rob already gave a nice, eloquent text answer to this, but just to get Gary's take on this, Aiden asks, given COVID, how has the entrepreneurial mindset changed? There are now more rules to be broken, as he puts it. And what are your thoughts on entrepreneurial mindset in the world of COVID, basically?
Well, that's really a great question. And I'll say it like this. What COVID brought forth, to me, in my mind, it really brought to the fore the idea that I said earlier, that we fail to recognize the extent to which other directed, routinized, rule-bound learning interferes with the development of entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. And what COVID brought forth was, to me, it became clear as ever that the employee mindset that was once essential, I want to be clear about that, has now become maladaptive, and really smart people are unable to adapt. They find themselves helpless and powerless when the rules aren't clear and the path is not well defined. That's what COVID has done. The other way I'll answer that question is, the world is full of, we're at a point of unprecedented opportunities. There's no shortage of opportunities in the world. What there's a shortage of is the ability to recognize and act upon those opportunities. That's how I think about COVID and the intersection of the entrepreneurial mindset.
Looks like Tom's
got a piece about results on the benefits of entrepreneurship education with a longitudinal study based in Denmark. So Tom, that's a really great resource we'll be digging into to see how it aligns and differs from our work. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Tom. And I'm working on a white paper right now, publishing a white paper about the entrepreneurial mindset imperative. But one of the things I point out in the white paper is that we have to think of the benefits beyond economic, right? We have to think about societal resilience. We have to think about psychological well-being, social integration. And you know, at the risk of sounding like this is just a cute, you know, corporate phrase, I really honestly believe that an entrepreneurial mindset optimizes engagement and unlocks human potential. And that's really the essence of it. And we've got to stop thinking of it strictly as a business discipline. We've got to look at it from a more broad perspective as a behavioral phenomenon. And I can't wait to read that paper that you referenced. Tom, thank you.
Okay, looking at time, let's press ahead. Rob, are you good to go?
I'm ready to go. So
Great.
let me share my screen here.
Thank you, Nick.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Oh, and Tom, just one last
Yeah,
moment.
go ahead.
Tom,
Yep.
Tom, referring back to Gary's comments, totally agree, Gary. Future wealth creation is not just finance, but also artistic, cultural, etc. So yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Tom.
Okay, and I think got my slides shared here.
Can see this fine.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Nick. I want to shift gears just a little bit now to talk. Gary has laid out the philosophy that has led our work here at the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative for the past 13 years. And now I want to lay out, and it's a great connection with what Tom was just talking about how we've been able to spread this idea already to many places around the world. So I'm going to give you some insight into that, talk about a few case studies, and then give you a little bit more detail on the actual programs that Michael has been utilizing already there with a few schools in Ireland. And as Gary laid out, our work here at the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative began in 2007, all around the idea of entrepreneurial mindset education. So our work is in developing professionals, most of the time in educators. So about 70% of the folks that we work with are educators, either in the higher ed systems or in the secondary systems around the world. And we provide that professional development to help them think more entrepreneurially in their work as educators, but then also for them to take those and learn enough to take those concepts and help their students develop a more entrepreneurial mindset. And we do that through facilitator training, workshops. We actually tomorrow, we just finished up a facilitator training with a group down in North Carolina where we've trained 200 folks just in the last year in these ideas. And what we came to realize, like with Michael, when he first learned about our work, he traveled here to the United States and had to pay, a few $1,000s for the course, and then also the travel expenses. And luckily, in early this year, in February, we offered our first online facilitator training program, which allowed for us to reach a broader scope without people having to travel. And then here in the US, we were a little bit behind the rest of the world by the time we got hit with COVID. By the time it got here March, April, we already had that baseline set of doing online trainings. So we've been doing online trainings and workshops since then to much success. And we actually think it allows for more depth of work into the materials rather than cramming it into just a few days when we're doing it in person. And then finally, I'd like to talk about our courseware, and specifically our Icehouse Student Success Program that Michael has been using successfully with some schools there in Ireland. So just wanted to give you that scope of our work before we jump into the presentation. So let's talk about how this program came about and some case studies that were developed. Initially, Gary talked about his work with the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute and interviewing those unlikely entrepreneurs around the country. Soon after that work was completed, the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation found out about this work. And if you're familiar with them, they're a multi-billion-dollar foundation that promotes entrepreneurship around the world. And the recognition by Kauffman that mindset was the critical piece that was missing when we talked about entrepreneurship education. So Kauffman brought Gary in, developed the Icehouse program that he has mentioned, and that sort of led to the genesis of our Icehouse programs, which we now have 4 that work with different constituencies. Now, the program itself has been briefed, by a prior president of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative, by Tom Rue, to the United Nations, and also to the Pontifical Council on Justice and Peace at the Vatican. So the high-level recognition of these ideas has definitely had an impact. And then just a few years ago, Gary also presented the program to the European Commission. So we're now recognizing, Tom mentioned the work that's being done in Denmark, and Michael, laid out in the action plans that are coming out from within the Irish education system. The recognition across the board that these concepts can have such a great impact on students as they learn to live in a more VUCA world. And you can look at the chat response I made to Aiden there to understand more about what we mean when we're talking about VUCA. Now, our scope since the time of the founding of our program and of ELI has now expanded to the point where we've trained nearly 2,600. We're right at 2,590 with completing this group we just finished this week of facilitators of our programs, of the entrepreneurial mindset training programs around the world. So we've trained about 500 folks from outside of the United States, from 26 different countries, of which Michael is one. We have one other trained in Ireland that we know, Emeka Chamora, who is up in Dublin. And the remainder of our facilitators, around 2,000, mostly reside in North America, across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. But we have, as this map points out, footprints all over the world where this work has gone. So let's talk about a few specific examples, I think, that relate directly to the work of the transition year coordinators and folks who are working with students in that 15, 16-year-old age range, where Gary laid out, they're looking for that compelling goal. They're trying to figure out what their life holds ahead of them, and they're trying to determine a path forward. And similar schools and similar school systems around the world have taken our ideas and implemented them in order to do that. And the first I want to point out is Tecnológico de Monterrey, which is a large institution throughout Mexico. It's actually 37 campuses across Mexico. And this is a preparatory school for the university where students would track into from that preparatory school. So we're talking essentially 16, 17-year-old students who are going to track into that university. Over 3 years, over 22,000 students took the Ice House Student Success Program, and I'll share the results here in a second. But you can see that the mission of TEC, aligned with educating leaders with this entrepreneurial spirit, a humanistic outlook, making them internationally competitive, aligns fully with our vision and mission of what the entrepreneurial mindset can do when young people are exposed to it and have the opportunity to have entrepreneurial experiences during their formative years. And some of the outcomes of this 3-year work with Prepa Tech, you can see here. We trained exactly 200 teachers within their system as facilitators of the program. Each year, there were around 7,500 enrolled. All 37 campuses participated. And they were offering almost 270 sections of the course. Those 5 bullets that are there in the middle were the goals of their program that Prepa Tech looked to bring about in doing this program with us. And they were all about hitting those 21st century skills to make those students internationally competitive. You can see that the teachers who, my wife's a teacher here in the United States. I've been in the classroom in different times over my career. And it's pretty difficult to integrate new programs and ideas into our education systems because teachers are overwhelmed each day with just making steps to move forward. And you can imagine right now in the COVID world, I know you're all dealing with trying to figure out how to still educate students effectively when it's being done online. And even in that type of environment where teachers are generally going to push back against new types of initiatives like this, when they were surveyed after this initial implementation, 94% of the teachers said, yeah, this is really valuable for our students. We need to continue this. There was also a survey done of parents of the students who were taking the program. And as you can see, 85% noted this positive change in how their child was acting because it allowed them to think more creatively, solve problems, and not get so bogged down by trying to understand their place in the world. Now we have a report that is from this first year that we worked with Prepa Tech, and we'll follow up this webinar when Nick and Michael work to send out that follow-up to those of you participating live today, or as you see this recording for the folks who just registered and we're expecting to see the recording. We'll follow up with this report so you can dig in a little bit more deeply and see the details behind that. The next example I wanted to talk about, sort of case study, is here in the United States, Erie, Pennsylvania. If you're not familiar, it's the western part of Pennsylvania. So here in the eastern part of the country, very industrialized area, a long history of coal mining that would lead to industry, coal mining in the mountains leading to the industry there in Erie, where large factories were building all kinds of equipment over the last few hundred years, a very industrialized town. And just like everywhere else in the world, and I know Ireland has gone through a transformation as well from being less reliant on a typical industrialized economy, Erie got hit very hard with this over the last 20 to 30 years. And so they've seen the result in their students, in their families, to where there just didn't seem to be as much opportunity as had been there prior for their students. So luckily, Erie had recognized the value of the work that we were doing. We had a number of facilitators there, both at the United Way within their public school systems. The United Way is a nonprofit organization here in the United States. And their work eventually led to us being able to train a large cadre of teachers who were teaching students at essentially the 13 and 14-year-old age, to the point to where now they're leading about 850 of those students through the Ice House Student Success Program each year. And they've actually transitioned now to our middle school program, which has a lot of detail for students that are right at that age. And you can see this quote from the assistant superintendent from B. Habersky there. She was one of the folks that helped bring the program on, that it really was helping students see that they, have role models that have this entrepreneurial mindset, and that they could see themselves moving forward, bringing the better things out into the world. There's actually a great video. If you go out on YouTube and just type this in, the Ice House Project for Erie's Public Schools, you're going to hear from Dave Cross, a teacher of that program. So those of you who are looking to maybe integrate some of these ideas in the classroom, Dave talks about that, and we can also connect you with Dave to talk about his work if you're interested. But I've got a few quotes from the kids they interviewed during this video. It's folks like Braden about, seeing more than one solution to problems. Kids like Shauna who, lots of times kids at this age, they think the world is as it is and there's nothing I can do. And she recognizes, no, I can bring about change in my community. Amanda's great when you watch this video, and she talks about how as a student at this age, you look around and you're not really sure what the world holds for you, and you're very tied to peer pressure and what your friends are doing. And now she's recognized that, myself, I can, as a person, really build a future for myself moving forward. And then finally, we love this quote from Madison because it's really gets to the core of our work here at the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative, where if we can get people to recognize that the problems that we see in our world, these great complex problems that we're all living through today, if we can change that and look at it through a lens of opportunity and how we can help solve those problems, we can make our communities a better place. So please check out that video. We'll also make sure that that link is sent if you can't quite locate it, but we'll make sure that that gets out to you. Before we jump to some questions here at the end, I want to just give you a quick overview of the Ice House Student Success Program. And this is what Michael has used successfully. And he talked about had those testimonials from the students from some of the schools there in Ireland where it's been used. And it's predicated on, we are named the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. So it's predicated on some really critical structure of a way to look at the way we look at learning and how it happens. Is it has to be experiential. We talk about students having to go through the entrepreneurial process on their own. They have to experience that with some mentorship, with some guidance. And that's where I think our programs are unique, is that we take someone who has never had any exposure to entrepreneurship at all, and help them become great mentors of guiding students through this experiential part of the program. You know, some of our best facilitators are philosophy professors, or Dave Cross, I mentioned, is a social studies teacher. So it's really meant to provide that type of environment where the students are experiencing more than just learning material. It's very project-based. So we want students to come up with their own problems. We don't want the problems to come from a top down with the teacher saying, okay, we think you should work on this, or this is the problem that I think we need to solve. It's very organic. The students decide on what projects they would like to move forward with, self-form teams around those ideas, and then move forward with it. Peer-to-peer learning is a huge part of entrepreneurial learning. And you heard Gary when he talked about, you know, connecting community to the classroom, and how that lesson 7, that 7th concept that we talk about how entrepreneurs, because there's not a strong structure, it's a very ambiguous environment, they have to learn from each other. So we make that in design part of the program, where there's a lot of peer-to-peer interaction, a lot of talking about their problems, briefing their problems out to the rest of the class, their work that they're doing so far, so that they can get that interaction. And we also talk about bringing in outside entrepreneurs to, and I'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the relatable models coming up. And finally, our goal of stepping and mentoring students through this entrepreneurial learning process is ultimately making them much more self-directed in their education. So if you think about those students in their transition year, when they're experiencing internships, they're doing these experiential type programs that are designed to expose them to different career fields, different things that they can move forward with their lives about. Ultimately, we'd love to have them be very self-directed, because that's where that motivation comes from to move forward. I mean, I have teenage kids. I've got kids now at the university level. Actually, all 3 of my kids are at the university level. And it's been amazing to see as they find that goal for themselves. And it makes things so much easier for them as they move forward. So we're ultimately trying to help move them into a more self-directed way of looking at the world. And the components of the program are really built on 3 strong legs of the program. The first is exposure to those 8 core concepts that Gary laid out a few minutes ago. And that's done through either video content or through actually written, like textbook type content. They're then immersed in those real world experiences. And I'll show you an example here of how that is begun with our opportunity discovery canvas. And then finally, it's reinforced with relatable examples. In order for people to adapt new behaviors, they have to see someone else like them who has similarly overcome the same types of problems to get where they're at in the world. So we have that embedded within the program. So the 8 core concepts that I mentioned in both text and video content, depending on how the program is used. Here's the opportunity discovery canvas, and it's really designed to bring out that critical thinking and to help students be creative, because they lay out in a very simplified fashion an in-depth understanding of the problem that they have identified that they would like to get involved with solving. And then they start digging into that problem. That's where the critical thinking, that's where the communication starts happening. As they then move forward and develop a solution, that's where they get to micro experiment, where Gary mentioned that concept, that 3rd concept, where they're taking action, they're micro experimenting, they're learning from the ideas that they're putting forth into the world. And then they're learning from those new ideas and going back and modifying their solution to eventually get to something that they can take more broadly out into the world. And that's where the connection piece comes in. Once they have a well-defined solution to their problem, they then have to look at getting it out into the world. And then finally, I just want to show a few pictures of the example of who we call the Ice House entrepreneurs. These are the relatable examples that we have embedded within the program. It's the interview content from that has been done with these unlikely entrepreneurs over the years. It's folks, from all across the spectrum. The second, individual there, Jason Campbell, was living in a very tough situation, foster parent with a parent who had been, having drug issues, et cetera. And through interaction and with an entrepreneur and some mentoring from an entrepreneur, was able to start his own small, cleaning business. And from there, it turned his life around to a point to where he became, highly decorated within the military and a college graduate, and has, gone on to do some amazing things since that initial time. And there's many others all throughout the program that you're exposed to. And I know that Michael has done work to bring in Irish entrepreneurs and specifically Irish examples as the students are going through the program. Okay, that's all of the presentation piece that I had planned to do. So now I saw a few things coming in on the chat. Nick, do we have any questions that we can hit here in the last few minutes?
Yeah, sure. Gary and I kind of already answered this, but I thought I'd bring it up for you as well with more of a programmatic answer. So for 15-year-olds, that average transition year age for students with stars in their eyes,
Right.
What are the best practices in how to adapt the entrepreneurial mindset to be applied to the classroom, given that most teachers generally don't have training and or real world experience as entrepreneurs? How are we kind of bringing the private sector in? So could you expand on that kind of connecting to community piece?
Sure. So for instance, Dave Cross and the work he did there in Erie, he, was not an entrepreneur himself, had no exposure to this. So he talked and actually talked with us and said, I'm going to go out and I'm going to try and develop some additional things that I think will really help connect with the kids that he was working with. So we actually ended up creating about 600 pages of worksheets and of interactive exercises that we have since made into an additional program. It's now our middle school program, sort of for those middle grades here in that program. And a large number of those experiential exercises that he came up with were finding ways for students to look out into the community. He has them looking at nonprofit organizations in their community that are doing work around areas where they could go volunteer. And so he has them research them and look for how their own interests connect with the work that's already gone in the community. And that's just one example. He also has them bring in entrepreneurial people that they know. So hopefully that can help add to that idea there for Aiden. But there's a lot of work there that he was able to do.
Absolutely. And I wanted to see, Michael, if you could maybe talk a little about your work to localize the program and how that's been going for you and how that's resonated with your students.
Thank you, Nick. That's a good question, Nick. In fact, one of the ways of localizing it at national and bringing it down to regional level is, Gary just said, interviewing successful entrepreneurs. Now, I have contacted a number of potentially very enthusiastic people about the program, and one in particular, I just mentioned his name. He's the founder of one of our airlines. He was a teacher. He's been on to me during the week. He's a guy called Padraig O'Cadig. He founded Arden Air, which is the regional aviation company, bringing a small haul airline, bringing short distance of 100 to 200 kilometers. But he's very keen, he's very interested in coming in and in the terms of localizing it, doing the video. So I've already spoken to a company who are very keen to, with me, interview him, and we will go through the entrepreneurial context of where he came from and the success he's had. The other guy in Cork, who will be very local here, for people, schools who will be interested locally, is the great entrepreneur and world explorer Pat Falvey. He has written a great book called You Have the Power, and he talks about mindset education. So he's another guy. So in fact, localizing it will be very keen to have interviews done with the entrepreneurs. So that's the next phase to come very shortly. And finally, of course, if there's any people who are looking on today, those even who couldn't be here because of problems in the schools where they wouldn't be able to come because of school work or attend the performance because they're in class, I'll be delighted to be available and to ensure that they see the video and to make contact with them. And in that context, Fiona O'Sullivan, who is my technical advisor here, she is very willing to engage with all the you people, the transition year coordinators. And finally, I hope to give a keynote address to the entrepreneurs, to the transition year coordinators of Ireland, if COVID permits, where they'll have their annual conference in Limerick in October. There'll be an opportunity to give a keynote address and to address many of the issues which they're faced with and which I hope to be able to interact with them. In relation to the program itself, we're flexible here to meet people in their schools and to, if you like, adapt it, modify it, and even reduce it in terms of size, because I realize the complexity of the scheduling and the time constraints that schools have. So I'm very flexible to, as I said, modify and engage with the schools as they progress in terms of wanting to engage with this marvelous program.
Outstanding. And yeah, Michael, that's exactly how the program was designed, to be able to ratchet it up or down depending on the needs of the school itself or the students. So
yes. The other thing, Rob, I must say, nobody has mentioned the content. The content, the content is just amazing. It's superb.
The depth of it,
depth. I mean, and the manuals, the books that are written by you guys, and the worksheets and the work programs and the assignments, they're very well integrated into the program, and the material is superb.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, we've worked hard to try and provide as many resources as possible, because we recognize, one of Gary's goals through the development of this program was the understanding that we can't get this concept out into the world by relying on entrepreneurs to come into the classroom. So we have to be able to train people who couldn't even spell entrepreneurship yesterday and get them trained to be able to get these concepts out to the students. So really
finally, Gary, there, I did discuss this with you. It's going to be critical in terms of the introduction of the program. If we use blended learning, for example, the self-paced, self-directed program is fine, but one of the essential elements, in my opinion, is that we train the facilitators. And I would see facilitators being trained, a teacher in a school being trained as a facilitator. And if we can sort of have the blended learning approach for a while as well, where there's facilitation, it could be on the Zoom, or it could be on person to person. Sure. But the fact that we have a facilitator, and any school that wants to bring in this program, that they would also be very encouraged to have a teacher who would be trained as a facilitator.
That's how our model has worked the best around the world, is by having those teachers that are directly there in the classroom, or having a coordinator who can help guide those teachers. It's very important. So, because even if this were to expand, like you're just one person, you couldn't possibly get to all the schools around Ireland. So it ultimately would rely on the teachers being trained there as facilitators of the program. So,
and there's a precedent in Ireland in a project which I was involved in. It's called the School Development Planning Initiative, SDPI, and the structure of the introduction of that program and on a national basis involved local training of key
Mhm.
people in the schools in the issue of what we call school planning. I would see that model as being appropriate for the introduction of this, the ISOS program or the school's student success program. There's a precedent for a very fine model to
Excellent.
be used. Okay, thanks.
All right. Well, I think with that, we're a few minutes over time, and we want to, you know, respect everyone's time. If there's any last questions, we'll stay on just a few extra minutes here to make sure that we've got all the questions fielded. Really appreciate spending the time with you. Michael and your team with Tony and Fiona, thank you for all your work to get this set up and connected. And then of course, you know, Nick, thanks so much, and Gary for spending the time with us today. We really appreciate the time to talk about these ideas.
Gary, finally, my final thanks to you guys for you taking your time in different locations all over the United States for presenting such an outstanding and most interesting webinar. Grameen Magrav.
Thank you,
All right.
Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
Honor.
Not seeing any questions, Nick, so we may